So good evening, greetings, and welcome to the University of Cape Town inaugural lecture by Professor Suren Pillay. I am Professor Erani Ramugondo, Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs and Social Responsiveness. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to what I am sure you know will be a thought-provoking lecture. A special welcome to Prof. Pillay's family. It's lifetime, life. Ooh, she did say I can say anything. I am stumbling over life partner because I'm avoiding wife. And I'm white. Wife or life partner, Associate Professor Archie Mafeje and daughter Anew. And I believe it took a while to leave home because Naledi couldn't settle on quite the dress. Looking great, Naledi. Colleagues and students, welcome as well for being here to celebrate this moment with Professor Pillay. Your presence is testament that one does not reach this epitome of academic positions alone. You always travel with those that support you and those who support you. They help you shopping your scholarship. I'd also like to recognize the members of tonight's platform party, Professor Shosekesi, the Dean of Humanities, who will introduce Professor Pillay, Professor Tsepo Madingozi, the Commissioner of South African Human Rights Commission, who will offer a vote of thanks. He takes a break from Budula by being here. It really is an honor to have you, Professor Madingozi. Your presence underscores the deep and ongoing connections between scholarship, human rights, and social justice that tonight's lecture will explore. And I must say, it's kudos to Professor Pillay to allow someone who's also a formidable scholar to speak at his event. It speaks to one's sense of intellectual pedigree to do so. An inaugural lecture is one of the most significant events in the calendar of UCT. It marks the formal conferral of full professorship, a recognition of excellence in research, teaching, and service. It also reflects the university's purpose, which seeks to advance knowledge that matters and to share that knowledge openly with society. Each inaugural lecture enables us to step back, even if for a few hours from the otherwise humdrum of academic life, and reflect on the ideas that shape our world, as well as celebrate those who dedicate their lives to thinking critically about it. Professor Pillay's lecture, The Eye Crosses the River Before the Body, Being and Becoming African in the University, challenges us to confront the unresolved legacies of colonialism in South Africa and their impact on higher education. It questions what it really means to decolonize universities in a society that often views its experience as exceptional rather than part of broader African and global history. And that is for some amongst us who still speaks of South Africa, visiting Africa. You know what I mean by that. Professor Pillay's reflections are based on 20 years of scholarship and a dedicated effort to understand how knowledge, power, and intersect within our institutions and lives. Decolonization, as many of you will appreciate, is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing intellectual and institutional effort that challenges us to examine the foundation of what we teach, how we teach it, and who we recognize as knowledge holders. It urges us to confront the histories that have shaped our institutions while also celebrating the creative and intellectual strength of African thought. In this sense, Professor Pillay's lecture will go beyond just academic reflection this evening. It serves as an invitation to re-evaluate the university's role in society. It challenges us to view knowledge as a shared and contested space, one that should be open to new voices, traditions, and ways of understanding the world. I'm reminded here of the words of Kenyan writer and scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who said, and I quote, "Decolonizing the mind is the first step in reclaiming our sense of self and our place in the world," close quote. These words resonate deeply with the theme of tonight's lecture. They remind us that decolonization begins with thought, questioning, and the courage to imagine differently. And of course, Ngugi raised very sharply the role of languages for facing linguicide in the context of colonization in reimagining the different reality. At UCT, we are committed to this work. Our Vision 2030 calls on us to unleash human potential to create a fair and just society. This means not only broadening access to education, but also rethinking the knowledge systems that underpin it. It means engaging in scholarship that connects the local and the global, that is self-reflective, and that contributes to the broader project of justice and transformation. This evening, we gather not only to celebrate an individual achievement, but also to reaffirm the values that define us as a university. The pursuit of knowledge is most powerful when it is linked to the pursuit of justice. It is through lectures like this one that we renew our collective commitment to creating a more inclusive and thoughtful academic community. Professor Pillay, I had to make eye contact. On behalf of the university, congratulations on reaching this significant milestone. We thank you for your scholarship, mentorship, and contributions to critical and courageous thinking. I will now call upon Professor Pillay, who will formally introduce our professor of the moment.
Vice Chancellor, Professor Lelwani Ramugondo, Sepo Madlingozi, Professor Suren Pillay and his family, dear colleagues and students here with us today. Today's inaugural lecture is truly special. My introduction is going to be a little bit long because there's so much to say. Professor Suren Pillay is an extremely accomplished scholar. His humility belies his great accomplishments in scholarship and beyond. A student president in Rylands High School in the late 1980s, to a fiery UWC political environment in the wake of the legendary Jakes Helvel's leadership that had declared UWC a home of the left. At tipping point of apartheid in South Africa, students and staff were seriously grappling with a crucial question: liberation before education or liberation through education? In a profound sense, this question has intimately stayed with Professor Suren Pillay throughout his life as he richly contributes to debates on higher education politics, questions of freedom and decolonization. His investments in activist scholarship formally date back to Kenya College in 1993, a proud public education institution that needs no introduction amongst activists in South Africa. There he was teaching on race and class, rooting his fight for workers' rights and enrolling in specialist training in advanced skills in conflict resolution and advanced industrial relations and negotiation skills. Once again, those activities have shaped and stayed with him till today, where he is one of the leading scholars on conflict. He was shortly a lecturer at Workers' College in Cape Town before he returned to UWC as a lecturer in 1996, an institution that would be his base for 27 years. At UWC, he was a leading researcher on political violence, colonial modernity, subjectivity, citizenship, with all the attendant tentacles that extend from these. In these years, he was also an incredible teacher on modern political theory, debates in democratic theory of citizenship, violence, and modernity, and other courses that his former students still praise him for. He is also a well sought after external examiner by universities all across South Africa for postgraduate students as someone with incredible reach and competency in anthropology, sociology, history, political studies, and African studies. He is a committed public intellectual, contributing to popular publications such as Chimuranga, Africa as a Country, Amandla Pambazuka, Mail and Guardian, the Cape Times, Daily Maverick, Al Jazeera International, BBC, Counterpunch, amongst others. Academically, he is a member of many professional associations in the field he works in, served in numerous boards and leading some, with many editorial roles. He has held many fellowships and visiting professorships across the world, in the global south as well as the global north, making him a truly grounded yet high-flying ambassador of our continent. A respected institution and network collaborations builder, Professor Pillay has accomplished much, so I will highlight only a few. He led the relationship between UWC's Center for Humanities Research with the Makerere Institute of Social Research, with his former supervisor and mentor, Professor Mahmoud Mafdani. Professor Pillay has had extensive networking and institution building with the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa and practices institution building even in the manner of his publications. His acclaimed edited volume on the subject of citizenship is itself a demonstration of networking and institution building, as the collaborators are from well-established working institutions in and of themselves. While at CHR, he led several major research projects: migrating violence, citizenship, migration and belonging in post-apartheid South Africa, citizenship and justice, politics and aesthetics, and other universals, which was a supranational project which established a consortium comprising of the universities of UWC, Cape Town, Wits, Addis Ababa, Ghana, Legon, American University of Beirut, University of West Indies, Cape Hill, and all the while contributing to leadership positions, including Deputy Dean of Research and Postgraduate Studies at UWC. In August 2023, he brought all of this wealth of experience to the University of Cape Town as the A.C. Jordan Chair of African Studies. He is Director of the Center for African Studies, HOD of the Department of African Studies and Linguistics. Its prestige as a chair means a lot to us institutionally, as A.C. Jordan was literally and symbolically a positive marker for changing this institution for the better as the first Black academic staff. As it stands, we live in the future that A.C. Jordan in many ways would have dreamt of, and quite in many other ways, we are still working towards it. Professor Suren Pillay will reflect on the complicated legacy of this past and its continuities in South Africa today. During the Rosemoss 4 protests, one of the most prevalent, persisting, and piercing questions was, can we have a decolonized university in an undecolonized society? Professor Pillay will address facets of this question in his talk, and will speak about the broader society that is South Africa, largely deemed a political miracle that is an exception to the trope of the rest of the African continent. Building from the scholarship of Professor Mamdani, Professor Pillay will advance a critique of this exceptionalism in an attempt to connect South Africa with other experiences in the global South generally and the rest of the African continent in particular. He has done this in his scholarly practice, through publications and supervision, by encouraging his PhD and master's students to work outside of South Africa within the African continent, or at least to do so comparatively. This is vital for creating a new generation of scholars that would have competency to research everywhere on the continent, with historical and theoretical depth of debates across Africa to address common themes. I must also mention a less known aspect of Professor Pillay's work, and that is his work as a creator. Indeed, from the early 90s till now, he has curated art exhibitions, mostly in photography, but also in film, literature, and also a writing of fiction. And currently there is a very stunning exhibition of his works at the Cass Gallery, and I strongly recommend it. Such an illustrious career means that Professor Pillay will be counted with the giants on whose shoulders he stands on. Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, David Scott, Partha Chatterjee, that were part of his PhD committee, for which he graduated with distinction from Columbia University, a very rare feat. And also Professors Sam Moyo and Tandika Mkandawire, in whose memory he dedicates his work as exemplars of a combative criticism conducted in solidarity and friendship. As a faculty and as an institution, we are fortunate to have Prof. Pillay choose us as the place where he delivers his inaugural and share the rest of his academic career, we hope. And we are grateful to all the places and institutions that shaped him, and mostly we are grateful to him. Professor Pillay, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose, and Professor Alawani. I just realized how busy I've been. I think I deserve a sabbatical. So this event, I think, has also made me reflect a bit on why I became interested in the subjects and research questions that I've been teaching on and researching. Does allow me to finish that sentence by saying that these are preoccupations that probably go beyond 2 decades, probably closer to 3 decades. And starting in high school in Athlone during the state of emergency of the mid-1980s was, of course, an accident of history that took some of us down rabbit holes of curiosities that we might not otherwise have. And another accident of history was that a couple of years after the elections of 1994, those of us living in Athlone lived through another kind of violence that was not necessarily the violence we'd grown up with in the 1980s. It was not violence against political activists as such, nor was it violence against insurgent guerrillas, nor was it violence against those perceived to be the agents of the state. It was violence against gangs. There was, of course, a considerable violence that communities today are living through between gangs. At that time, it was a violence that pitched gangs against the new phenomenon of anti-gang groups. And growing up in Athlone, many of us shared familiarity with gangsters, but also an intimate familiarity, as I discovered, with those standing up to the gangs in the form of an organization that came into existence called the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, PAGAD. When I say an intimate familiarity, I mean gangsters were not a sociological abstraction to us. nor with the members of Pagad. The racially configured group areas that we grew up in had a compressing effect of bringing working class and middle class people into lived proximity. People involved in questionable activities, shall we say, were sometimes our schoolmates, or friends, or cousins of friends, or uncles, or just people we knew through their local legends or infamy, directly or indirectly through Klipfontein Road that linked us all. The unraveling of apartheid coincided with the end of the Cold War in 1989. The identity of adversaries in the world shifted. Who was a friend and who was an enemy changed. During the Cold War, the distinction was between those who were said to identify with communism and those who were said to identify with the free world. The American political scientist Samuel Huntington, a friend, some of you might know, of the apartheid government, wrote a bestseller in which he described the post-Cold War world as entering the new phase that was returning to old battles. The battleground of the post-Cold War world, he said, was to be defined by a clash of civilizations between the West and the rest, particularly the West and Islam. Huntington saw the challenges that would face the West through the vantage point of a return to the battles of antiquity, a restaging almost of the Crusades in which Islam was the threat. It was a tempting argument for many, even if it was fundamentally historically flawed. But most importantly, it found traction among a group of policymakers in Washington that have come to be known as the neocons, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and their political champion, Dick Cheney. As some of you might recall, Pagad as a movement drew on versions of Islamic tradition and symbolism. The kafia that students wore to conceal their identity on the streets of Athlone from the police in the 1980s also was inspired, of course, by the secular use of it by the PLO during the Intifada, but was also part of the traditional dress of Bedouins in the region. And it was now being worn by members of Pagad, used to also conceal their identity when violently confronting gangsters on the Cape Flats. Criminal lawyers, sociologists, and political scientists call these kinds of movements vigilantism because they take on the right to punish and judge, rights that are legally reserved for the police and the courts, rights of the state. Out of curiosity, I attended and photographed the marches of Pagad and against gangsters, witnessing shooting battles in Hanover Park, in Manenberg, and by chance being in the Lower Salt River the night when one of the most notorious leaders of the Hard Livings gang, one of the twin brothers, found his fiery end in full view of the press and others. But it was when Pagad in 1998 was placed on the US list of international terrorist organizations that I became interested in how something so ordinary and local had become inserted into a global story of the clash of civilizations. On an obvious level, it seemed to be that this was the problem with gangs, a common story of how working class youth to this day join gangs, a story about what gangs do for them, a story rightly or wrongly about how in the absence of prospects in formal education or in the formal economy, young men find community status, meaning, purpose, and of course, death often. On the other hand, it was also a story of a response to the violence of gangs, a violence of gangs to produce among some people in the community an idea that the state was failing them. The reactions in communities to oppose, often through civic organizations or neighborhood watches, and these movements that oppose the violence of gangs themselves can become coercive and violent. What was interesting was how the local sociological dynamics were overtaken when conscripted into this new geopolitical clash of civilizations between jihadists and the West. It was noticeable that others on the list of international terrorist organizations, such as the Taliban, had only just stood on the lawns of the American White House a few years before, lauded by the American President Ronald Reagan as great freedom fighters, what he called the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. In the Cold War, of course, it was communists, people like the Cubans and Fidel Castro, or countries under the federations of the Soviet Union, who are our enemies. While the jihadist movements who resisted Soviet occupation in Afghanistan were considered the friends of the West and armed and financed. Since the signing of the Grooteskeur Minute, not too far from us here, within the span of just a couple of years after the end of the Cold War, some dramatic name changes had taken place. Individuals designated as terrorists, people like Joe Slovo, Mac Maharaj, or Joe Modise, were wearing suits and sitting in parliament with those who saw them as enemies not too long ago, and they were calling each other honorable members. An ongoing book project I've been working on has been about how these name changes happen. The training in a kind of anti-communist pedagogy through counterinsurgency training designated anti-apartheid activists beyond the pale of Western civilization, resulting in their brutal assassinations, not necessarily just by evil men, but as an extension of common sensibilities held by many white South Africans about how Western civilization needed to be protected by any means necessary. I became curious about the politics of who gets to decide who is a friend and who is an enemy, and when, why, and how these designations change in knowledge and in history. In the South African case, the arch terrorist, as Margaret Thatcher had called him, Nelson Mandela, was now sitting at the head of a government accepted by the West, lauded for its struggle to end the system of racism. If one looks at the story of the negotiations, it is a story at the beginning about renaming terrorists. To be able to talk to them, the apartheid state and global Western powers had to literally transform political enemies into political opponents. It was also clear that the power to name who is a friend and enemy is not a power that belongs to all. It is a right claimed by only some as their right. From at least the 11th century, that power was claimed as the right of the papacy of Latin Christendom to decide. These decrees were made in the form of papal bulls, the most impactful on us all probably being the doctrines of discovery, which authorized the seizure of lands from non-Christians and the subjugation of the peoples who may happen to live on those lands. The political authority of the Roman papacy would name who large tracts of the earth belonged to designate who was a heathen, decide who was a beast of burden, and decide who or what could be bought and sold. This was the prerogative that those who declared themselves the civilized peoples, the chosen people, have claimed for themselves perhaps ever since. You could rightly wonder if this theological right, claimed by medieval Europe, has in modern times transformed itself into the right of some secular states who attempt to dominate, deciding on big questions that face humanity in the name of defending civilization. Rights such as the power to decide who should have nuclear weapons, not that anyone should have nuclear weapons, or most immediately to decide when international law matters, who is subject to it, who is exempt from it, or when and where and to whom crimes against humanity like genocide are occurring. Yeah, of course, there is a rands and cents or dollars and cents way to apprehend the motivations of why this hubris continues to define the modern world. You might expect me to quote Marx now, but let me turn to Roger Waters of the British conceptual rock band Pink Floyd, if only because this journey into the 80s reminded me that they were part of the soundtrack of the student rebellion. Their famous album, The Wall, which was banned in apartheid South Africa, was played. There was a way to listen to it, and I remember it blaring in the school hall of Rylands High at some point through the loudspeakers. In his 2002 album, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Waters wrote the following lyrics to the song. When you add it all up, the tears and the marrow bone, there's an ounce of gold and an ounce of pride in each legend. And the Germans killed the Jews, and the Jews killed the Arab, and that's the news. And is it any wonder that the monkey's confused? He said, Mama, the president's a fool. Why do I have to keep reading these technical manuals? And the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the brokers of Wall Street said, don't make us laugh. You're a smart kid. Time is linear. Memory is a stranger. History is for fools. Man is a tool in the hands of the great God Almighty. And he gave him command of a nuclear submarine and sent him back in search of the Garden of Eden. This is a slightly winding way to explain my curiosity about how the power of naming and classifications work and how colonialism made the modern world by apprehending the world in particular ways through its interpretation and its naming and its knowledge. Naming and classification were central to how colonial states were organized. The historical anthropologist Nicholas Dirks has called colonial states ethnographic states. The Indian political theorist Partha Chatterjee argues that they ruled through colonial difference. The Ugandan political theorist Mahmoud Mamdani describes it as the project to define and rule. Since the scientific revolution of the Enlightenment, the practice of naming or classifying those who practiced a different religion, or later those who looked different, became an extension of political power that divided humanity. But the problem is not inherently with recognizing difference, nor is it inherently with classifications. The problem is how difference is interpreted. What meaning is attached to different? That's the political question. This is when difference becomes part of a story about hierarchies. In the space of our lifetime, we can already see the status of groups of people change or resist change between being civilized and uncivilized, slave or free, beast or human, terrorist or freedom fighter, and most recently from victim to perpetrator. This was what the controversial German legal theorist Carl Schmitt described as the essence of the political, the sovereign power to decide in different historical moments on the distinction between a friend and an enemy. When the leader of the first African country to get independence from colonial rule, Kwame Nkrumah, said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all things shall be added unto you," he understood that political independence was about claiming back the prerogative to define oneself for oneself. Other aspects of freedom, such as social freedoms and economic freedoms, Nkrumah thought, were to be added unto you thereafter. The primary, that is the first, but not the only condition for a society to decolonize itself, was political freedom, to name who one was in the world. The influential Russian-British philosopher Isaiah Berlin famously divided liberty into two parts, negative liberty and positive liberty. Being free from political domination by a foreign empire was a form of negative liberty. But what of positive liberty, the freedom to do things? How could or would this freedom from political domination translate into the positive liberty to make a new society? Would relinquishing political control also mean conceding economic control? Would lowering the Union Jack in the evening mean the people who wake up in the morning with free minds to, in Frantz Fanon's terms, dare to invent the future? Minds that have been told to follow orders, to revere and fear and worship their masters for centuries, suddenly were expected to make a new world, imagine a new world into existence in societies in which the British saw no point of educating Africans beyond the function of menial labor. In some parts of Africa, there is a saying that goes, "The eyes cross the river before the body." It speaks to the importance of the imagination. If you cannot imagine crossing the river with its unknown flowing tides and dark waters, the body will remain inert. The Sierra Leone poet Aboshe Nicol wrote in the 1950s, "You are not a country, Africa. You are a concept, fashioned in our minds, each to hide our separate fears, to dream our separate dreams." If colonial education restricted the imagination of creativity and freedom, decolonizing education at its simplest in the early post-colonial attempts encouraged creativity and the freedom to imagine amongst people defined by centuries as having no worthy culture, no worthy civilization, no worthy imaginations, no worthy history. In the immediate wake of independence, there was literally a festival of festivals. There was, for example, the Dakar Festival of Negro Arts, supported by the Senegalese president Leopold Sédar Senghor in 1966. This was interesting because it was also boycotted by the Guinean leader Sékou Touré because of the festival's affinity Sékou Touré felt to negritude. Sékou Touré criticized negritude for defining Black people by their race rather than by a shared political and cultural connection to Africa, anticipating by decades Biko's later theorization of Blackness as a shared experience of oppression. Sekou Touré took a dim view of negritude, lamenting that its racial focus was the product of colonialism. He believed negritude was a backward looking concept, creating an essentialist racial identity that acted as a form of discrimination and hindered the goal of a unified progressive Africa. Sekou Touré might have been a bit harsh on negritude, some even say a bit unfair. But he was not alone in that worry. It was a dispute that hinted that decolonization was not going to be a straightforward matter. It would mean grappling with whether decolonizing gestures themselves break free from colonial ideas or end up repeating them. As an alternative, Sekou Touré advocated for a pan-Africanism based on political solidarity and shared destinies, not racial identity. And he threw his energies into supporting the 1969 Pan-African Festival in Algeria. There was also at that time, of course, the historic conference on Festival of Writers, the African Writers of English Expression, held at Makerere University College in 1962. This was the first major international gathering of African writers sponsored by the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Mbari Club, and attended by prominent literary figures like Chinua Achebe, Wally Soyinka, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, then known as James Ngugi. The conference addressed the future of African literature and the legacy of colonialism, with a divisive debate about the future merits of writing in English. James Ngugi, of course, became known to us as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the novelist, but also because he wrote an important book called Decolonizing the Mind and decided to write his fiction in his native language, Kikuyu, after this conference and this debate. It signaled that, too, that decolonization was going to have to contend with the historical privilege of colonial languages, with how to undo the diminished status of local languages. At the time, there was also the founding of the Carthage Film Festival, inaugurated in Tunis in 1966, which in turn gave birth to the Pan-African Film and Television Festival of Ouagadougou, known as FESPACO, in 1969. It's held biannually in Burkina Faso and is now in its 29th year. Many of these festivals were sponsored by states. To return to the source of culture, as Amilcar Cabral had put it, was to reconnect the historicity of politics and people. It was about creating a modern Africa whose development was historically suspended by colonialism. How then to make a new society after empire lowered its flag and sailed off was also Nkrumah and Nyerere's problem in 1956. The civil service, the army, the universities were still predominantly European because there were hardly any locals trained. A new generation of scholars debated the influence of colonial knowledge on how Africa was rendered. Colonial rule had racialized and sliced up the continent into, besides the arbitrary nature of the borders, also into a northern part and a sub-Saharan landmass beyond the Sahara. A geographical landmass called Africa was transformed into a race identified as occupied by Negroids by colonial writers. Colonial knowledge, particularly through what is called the Hamitic hypothesis, distinguished between racial migrants who carried the civilized blood of European forebears into Africa with them and the indigenous Black Bantu or Negroid population. Any sign of civilization in Africa was explained by recourse to the Hamitic hypothesis as a result of a European civilizing presence. Negroid descendants could only be considered to have some civilized merit if a trace of European blood could be found in them. This was, since 1790, a situation that arose in 1798 with Napoleon's expedition into Africa when they confronted the reality of the pyramids. They could not believe the Sphinx to be the product of an African civilization because the accounts Europe had of Africa before that was of the dark continent that offered nothing. To maintain that narrative, Egypt, of course, was separated from Africa. Its people said to have European blood in them. Egypt since became its own field of study called Egyptology. Sites like Meroe, Nuri, and Al-Kuri in neighboring Sudan have more pyramids than in Egypt, but have simply disappeared from the story because the statues and Nubians and the Cushitic dynasties are less ambiguously the product of darker-skinned, Negroid-looking peoples. Groups like the Tutsi, the Fulani, the Somalis, the Abyssinian descendants, the Berbers, and the so-called colored peoples were said to have descended, according to Charles Seligman's influential textbook, from Hamitic migrants. And he placed on that a civilizational hierarchy. They were to be above the Bantu language speakers, but never equal to pure-blooded Europeans. Not only did colonial knowledge declare that Africa was a race and not a continent, it also declared which religions were foreign and which were indigenous. Even if the churches at Lalibela and the mosques of Aksum in Ethiopia tell us a different story, that these religions have been with us on the continent at least since their birth. In the embrace of nationalism after independence, European genius was displaced in some instances by the search for African genius. Critics of these Afrocentric turns have asked if this decolonized our understanding of Africa, or did it merely turn the picture upside down but still repeats a Eurocentric logic? A post-colonial generation of scholars, among them set out to produce knowledge from Africa that could challenge these assumptions by initiating research and debate amongst themselves. Scholars like Boubacar Barry, Jacques de Pelchin, Ernest Wambadia Wamba, Zenaba Wokadese, Ali Mazrui, Ife Amadiyume, Archie Mafeje, Suleiman Bashir Jan, Amadou Maktoum Ambao, Samir Amin, Mamdani, of course, Fatima Mernisi, Tansin Keita, Tandikam Kandawire, Isa Shivji, Fatima Harak, Halmi Sharawi, saw a radical form of Pan-Africanism as necessary to undo the colonial geography that separated the continent geographically and linguistically, and that racialized the question of who and what is African. The search for a single place, as one of the scholars put it, appears yet another version of the continuation of a 19th century-based search for purity. The alternative would be, each scholar argued, to think of Africa not in terms of one original inspiration, but a plurality of influences, not a single origin, but a confluence, what Ali Mazrui would call the triple heritage. A legitimate question, though, to ask ourselves is whether we should be speaking these days of colonialism and decolonization other than as history. What does it all have to do with the world we live in today? After all, the leader of the British Empire, Harold Macmillan's winds of change had swept across the continent in the 1960s. There were those who would say that the independence of Ghana in 1956 bookends the start of decolonization in Africa, and South Africa's non-racial election in 1994 concluded decolonization in Africa. But it's more than a discussion of when colonialism ended or started. It's also a debate about the role of the past in the present. Does the past influence the present in a way that has consequences for how we could make a future? In 2005, the celebrated French anthropologist of African studies, Jean-François Bayard, and his colleague Bertrand Romain asked, what colonial legacy are we talking about? Bayard and Romain questioned thinking abstractly about colonialism with a capital C, what they called treating colonialism's legacy, quote, as a quasi-metaphysical postulate. Rather than speak of a colonial legacy, they suggest, we should think of colonialism as a diversity of experiences, of its complexities, of its contingencies, of each case, insisting on each case, unable to make any durable claim about an enduring colonial legacy, producing in that moment, when we do that, only half-truths and fallacies. Claims that explain contemporary phenomenon by reference to colonialism, they argued, could only be considered on a case-by-case basis. In 2002, in a searing intervention following his appointment as the executive secretary of the most significant Pan-African Association of Scholars, the Council for Social Science Research in Africa, founded in 1973, the Cameroonian political theorist, historian Achille Mbembe, incidentally a former student of Bayard, rattled a hornet's nest with an essay titled African Modes of Self-Writing. The provocation of the essay can be summed up by Mbembe's exasperation with a generation of post-colonial African scholars, most of whose names I had previously rattled off, of African scholars and Marxists in particular, who have insisted on the debilitating political, cultural, economic, and social grip of colonialism as producing a neo-colonial stranglehold of a racial and economically imperial world on Africa. This legacy continued to place fetters and produce fissures that undermined the emergence of emancipated societies who could realize their post-colonial freedom. But Mbembe lambasted this post-colonial generation of scholars for what he called their mechanistic and reified vision of history. Causality, he said, is attributed to entities that are fictive and wholly invisible, but are nevertheless said to determine and ultimately the subject's life and work. According to this point of view, he said the history of Africa is reduced to a series of subjugations: colonialism, capitalism, apartheid. It's narrativized in a seamless continuity. African experience of the world, he said, is supposed to be determined a priori by a set of forces, always the same ones, though appearing in different guises. Bayard had called this quasi-metaphysical postulate. Mbembe was more or less saying the same thing, but he gave it an African twist. He described it as writing history as sorcery. For him, this produced an ontology of victimhood. We were trapping ourselves in our past. In a more recent, perhaps even more sharply polemical discourse, the Nigerian philosopher Taiwo continues in this vein in his book titled Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. Provoked by the 2015 return to the demand for decolonization in the student movements, Taiwo distinguishes between what he calls decolonization 1, which refers to the wave of political independence from the 50s onwards, and decolonization 2, the invocation, as we do, of decolonization to talk about the enduring influence of colonial discourse in knowledge, in economics, in politics, and in our society. He explicitly urges us to reject this contemporary turn to speaking about the present as a problem related to decolonization. It's worth recalling at this point the response of the late exiled South African anthropologist Archie Mafeje to Achille Mbembe's argument in African modes of self-writing. Whilst we are free, Mafeje said, to choose the role in which we cast ourselves as active agents of history, we do not put on the agenda the social issues to which we respond. These are, he highlighted, imposed on us by history. Agency, argued Mafeje, was not a free-floating signifier abstracted from both historical conditions or material reality. In other words, we might be free to choose the things on a menu, but have we drawn up the menu? When the menu is made by those who emphasize race, we end up talking about racism. Does that mean one is being a victim, or is that called resistance? Mafeje rightly, in my view, argued that we are obliged, not of our own making, to respond to the world as we inherit it in order to remake it. There is a difference, perhaps, between victimhood and resistance, a distinction that Bayard, Mbembe, and Taiwo seem to forget. The challenge, though, as Fanon argued, is to resist in a way that transcends the categories, including those of naming and classification of history and identity that colonial power has tried to impose on the colonized. Colonialism, then, could be thought of as a matter best left to the past if you are persuaded by that other argument. Yes, empires gave way to nation states. The sun did actually finally set on the British Empire, so too the French, the Belgians, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Their territorial monopolies of control unraveled so that free nations could declare national independence. But as nation states, Britain, France, Germany, and the nation states of the New World, such as the United States of America, became custodians of what Nkrumah soon saw as neocolonialism, immediately after the end of formal independence. The future, as Nkrumah saw it, could not fully come into being if the grip of the past in the present wasn't loosened. European social science has extolled to us the virtues of objectivity, which functioned actually to obscure the race, the gender, and the historical location of a writer. We bring the past with us into the production of knowledge, whether it be the past of privilege or the past of our marginality. Colonialism most immediately lives on in the teaching and research enterprise through two historical inheritances in settler colonies: racial exclusion on the one hand and Eurocentrism. To move beyond being an apartheid university, we can't prioritize the one over the other. We have to contend with both. But what a difference a decade makes. Earlier this year, the Center for African Studies at UCT hosted an event on behalf of the university to reflect on 10 years since the Rhodes Must Fall movement that had erupted on campus. I was not at UCT when the events of 2015 and 2016 unfolded, although I was on the campus the day the statue of Cecil John Rhodes quite literally ascended. And I do have the memory of being invited to share some thoughts on the decolonization of knowledge with the students who occupied this very building. The students had the idea of turning this building and this room, Bremner House, into an experimental pedagogical space they had called Azania House. I was a staff member at the University of the Western Cape, a historically Black university with a celebrated history in the struggle against apartheid down on the Cape Flats. The evening before I spoke here, I was in an occupied student residency invited by some of the students there. Those were indeed heady and, to be sure, unsettling days, and reminded some of us of our vivid experiences of the school boycotts on the Cape Flats, when we as students fumbled our way towards what would be called a people's education, something that would replace the remnants of Bantu education. I think the RMF students reminded us that racism was not directed just to making judgments about our skins or how we look, the outside of our being, but the violence of colonial racism was also that it applies to the partitioning of our minds. Many taught in apartheid universities were taught that there was nothing to learn from those north of the Limpopo. As Divisel Ramogonda said, we sometimes still say we're going to Africa. In what was described going to the dark continent. So too, similarly, nothing or very little could be learned from Latin America or Asia or the Middle East. All of those names themselves, cartographic markers with a colonial history. Courses on Africa tend to follow the American Africanist textbook chronology, divided into pre-colonial Africa, colonial Africa, and post-colonial Africa. In other words, Africa before the white man came, Africa during the time of the white man, Africa after the white man. I've noticed that in African political science courses in American universities in the syllabus, they often only prescribe one reading by an African author for that last section of the course dealing with Africa after the white man. Chinua Achebe's 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart. There's nothing further to say. But we have come a long way. And there's a long way to go. The more so we witness the anxiety of a global minority of racial elites trying to turn back the tide of history to a time when they reigned supreme. Independence gave Africans a degree of political sovereignty, but we know it did not entirely give us economic sovereignty. But to have both, we need to be able to see across the river. We need a degree of sovereignty over our imaginations to carry us over the adversity to get to the other side. I have said that the two challenges before us are deracialization and Eurocentrism. And in the next section, very briefly, I'm going to race through three propositions for decolonization with you. The first proposition is that in the university, the primary task of decolonizing our imaginations requires undoing Eurocentrism. The second proposition is that we inherit racialized universities in post-settler colonial societies like South Africa. So deracializing the university is a very important goal. But here is the caveat. Deracialization without decolonization will leave Eurocentrism in place. And the third proposition is that decolonization in South Africa, without a commitment to Pan-Africanism that seeks to undo the Eurocentric ways we have come to understand the world, will become nativism. Nativism in Africa is built on the colonial account of who is indigenous. And we know that nativism produces xenophobia, and we've seen it slide into genocide. Let me clarify very briefly what I mean by Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is an ideological term first coined in the 1970s by an African scholar, Samir Amin, an Egyptian Marxist economist who was a founding member of CODESRE. Amin used the term in the context of the debates about dependency theory, which was a theory developed by Latin American sociologists who argued that capitalism causes the exploitation of those named as underdeveloped states, the peripheries of the world, by those who consider themselves developed, the core states. The global system was made up of the core and the periphery. Amin argued that capitalism was premised on a colonial system put in place by empires that benefited Europe at the expense of the peripheries. Amin linked capitalism, colonialism, and race arguing that modern Africa was the outcome of how Europe put itself at the center of this world. Building on Amin and others, the Palestinian American literary scholar Edward Said, talking about the history of the Middle East, showed how important knowledge and ideas about non-European parts of the world was in making this supremacy Europeans felt towards non-Europeans possible and enabling them ideologically to treat non-Europeans at various points in history as non-believers, as heathens, as pagans, as slaves, as non-human, as people needing to be governed. Said called this entire body of colonial knowledge about the East Orientalism because it produced an account of the Orient premised on this Eurocentrism. I quote, Eurocentrism is a way of seeing that is rooted in the geographic, economic, technological, and political dominance of Europe and its overseas empires in the modern period. Eurocentrism is Eurocentric because it provides the template and the endpoint to which all should move, against what all should be judged. In this account, the West is great because its genius is invented since the Greeks, the Enlightenment, and the modern ideas of rationality of science, mathematics, medicine, technology, engineering, as our former mayor of the Cape reminds us. The argument some people would suggest is that another argument some people would suggest is that real decolonization requires de-Westernization because all of these ideas are not our ideas. They are invented by Europeans. They are imposed on us. I would, in a very shorthand way, say that's simply not true. What is accurate is that Europe claims they invented these ideas, and that is what makes the West great. But where does the al in algebra or al in alchemy come from? Or where does the numerical system globally used today originate from? The Arabic sounding prefix should give you a clue. And a number of those Arabs who contributed to this knowledge were African. In his 1988 book, The Invention of Africa, the brilliant Congolese philosopher Valentin Mudimbe, who recently sadly passed away, tells the story of how the famous American astronomer Carl Sagan, some of you might remember him from his TV shows, explains how the Dogon people of Mali had a theory of cosmology in which the Earth orbits around the sun that seemed to predate later European discoveries of this thesis. But he goes on. The Dogon go further. They hold that Jupiter, says Sagan, has 4 satellites and that Saturn is encircled by a ring. Unlike every astronomer before Kepler, the Dogon are said to depict the planets moving correctly in elliptical and not circular orbits. Most amazing for Carl Sagan seems to be the following. The Dogons contended that Sirius has a dark and invisible companion star which orbits Sirius once every 50 years. They state that the companion star is a very small and very heavy and is made of a special metal called sagala. Sagan fabulated the following hypothesis to explain, or rather explain away, how the Dogon came to these insights, whom he called a pre-scientific people. I picture, said Sagan, a Gaelic visitor to the Dogon people. He may have been a diplomat, an explorer, an adventurer, or an early anthropologist. This man, he says, has read or still has a copy of Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington's book, The Nature of the Physical World, published in 1928, in which the density of the white dwarf stars are discussed. Mudimbe goes in some depth in the book to contradict Sagan's version, drawing on the available knowledge that confirmed that this theory had been part of a cyclical Dogon ritual enacted only every 60 years. And there are accounts of it by anthropologists going well into the 1700s, at least 100 years before any Europeans came up with the theory. But rather than imagine the Dogon could come up with such knowledge on their own, others have even speculated that they were visited by extraterrestrials who imparted this knowledge to them. There's another funny but sad true story of a survey done a couple of years ago in the United States in the context of the post-9/11 Islamophobia that gripped the US. It asked whether the American education system should allow the use of Arabic numerals in schools. The assumption was, of course, that Arabs were the enemy, and enemies should be expunged. And a majority of the respondents to the survey emphatically said no, Arabic numerals should not be used in American schools. Let that sink in. They were completely ignorant to the fact that the standard numerical system in use in the world today, which had replaced the cumbersome Roman numerals a couple of hundred years ago, was invented by Arabs and Indians and is commonly referred to as the Arabic numerals. So, should we de-Westernize? Or should our task be to undo the Eurocentric story about Western invention and genius? To accept the idea that scientific knowledge is Western and European and that decolonization should mean something called de-Westernization is perhaps to accept the Eurocentric story. In a 2005 reflection on the remaking of the university after colonialism, the renowned Tanzanian intellectual Issa Shivji, who was at the heart of many of these debates in East Africa at the University of Dar es Salaam and Makerere in the 1960s, lamented that we allow this Eurocentric division of intellectual history to persist. This is, he said, the other very fundamental concern that African academics still have to address. The knowledge we impart is crafted on the basis on the premises and within the paradigms of European studies. It is Eurocentric through and through. What is European is universal, the non-European is at best multicultural, at worst parochial. And in 1 minute, then, let me conclude with the remaining two propositions concerning deracialization and the university. If the challenge for decolonizing knowledge is to undo Eurocentrism, then decolonized knowledge requires, I think, the humility to acknowledge that we often lack the expertise at this point to properly teach the intellectual traditions of what the Senegalese scholar Usman Khan has called non-Europhone intellectual traditions. Put simply, it means our universities need different voices from which to draw, which we can draw in the rich heritage of non-European traditions of knowledge across Africa, but also across the non-European world. We have to keep the door of Pan-Africanism open and the doors of learning and culture open to bring in students, expertise, and languages that will help us to understand ourselves in less Eurocentric ways. If at this critical juncture, we only think of decolonization as deracializing the university, the lesson from the continent is a retreat into nativism, a nationalist closing in on ourselves, and in the process, a closing of our minds. These are not easy realities to navigate because we simply have to change the racial and gendered composition of our teaching staff and our students. Despite the significant changes, Black South Africans and women have suffered the legacies of Bantu education, thought of as hewers of wood and drawers of water, as cheap and unskilled labor. They remain significantly underrepresented through all the rungs in the university, from lecturer through to particularly professor and administrator. Fair discrimination is a just and right policy at this conjuncture. And at the same time, if we wish to produce a new generation of students who can think the world and be in the world in less Eurocentric ways, we cannot choose one at the expense of the other. The alternative is already before our eyes. We see those from across our borders as enemies. We think of them as those we have to expunge from the community. Some in former colonial powers, as we know, wish to expunge their former colonial subjects from their body politic. We are all aware of the wave of anti-immigrant sentiment we see in parts of Europe. It's hard not to conclude that as nostalgia for racial supremacy undergirds the movement to make America great again, when we witness the expulsion of non-white migrants, including those from Africa, while we see the fast-tracking recruitment of African whites as so-called refugees. Paraphrasing Fanon, this may be the nightmare that unfolds when the settler dreams again of nativism. The Martinican poet Aimé Césaire said the European Enlightenment may have given us an important idea of everyone being human. But he also said that Europe, after the experience of Nazism, was incapable of truly fulfilling its promise to every human being. It would be up to the former colonized to fulfill that promise. If we can see across the river, if our minds can imagine a better future, we have a chance of carrying our bodies over. The university, and in particular, I would say the humanities, for that reason, is a very special place because that's what we do. We activate the minds, we encourage the imagination to transcend limits. And I will end with the indulgence of looking across the river. What I see is every African university offering their students, no matter what subject they are taking, an exposure to the humanities. That would perhaps make the world a decolonized place. Thank you.
of text and of naming. I now call upon Professor Madingozi to give his vote of thanks.
Madam, good evening. I know I'm standing between you and Babylon waters, but also as a national commissioner, I should not violate your right to food. But I've been given a very simple task, which is to give a vote of thanks. But first of all, let me greet the DVC, Vice Chancellor Mukudu, the Dean of Humanities, Shona Chezi. Oh, I didn't see you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. But most importantly, allow me to extend our thanks to Professor Suren Pillay's friends, colleagues, teachers, and indeed comrades. But most importantly, where are they? They're not here. Oh, there. I would like to, on behalf of the university, extend our vote of thanks to Professor Pillay's wife, Associate Professor Chatuvendi, Naledi. Who is Naledi? I don't see Naledi. Gogo Florence Pillay, is she here? Yes, Gogo Florence and Vasun. Thank you so much. Anita, where are you, Anita? Anita, and is your husband here, Pritesh? Oh, it's not here, the children. But thank you so much. Indeed, it takes a village to get to this point. I don't want to spoil such a beautiful lecture by giving another lecture. I don't want to do that. I want you to remain with this beautiful, beautiful set of text and set of reflection. But allow me in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes to say the following, to say, thank you so much, Professor Pillay, for over 2 decades of exceptional work. I am being sincere when I say, to me, at least, no other scholar has provoked our thinking on belonging and belongingness, such as Professor Pillay has done. When Professor Pillay invited me, he told me that there's been a delay in the scheduling of the lectures and that, this was scheduled and, I must come. But I want to say that it is not a coincidence that this lecture takes place this year, because of course it's taking place this year when we're in the midst of a number of anniversaries. I can talk about, the state of emergency. This year is the 40th anniversary of the state of emergency, the 40th anniversary of the Kairos document, of course. Do you know the Kairos document? Yes, okay, you know the Kairos document. But I want to reflect on 3 anniversaries that really speak to the predicaments that Professor Pillay has wrestled with. The first one, of course, is that this year is the 65th anniversary of the Freedom Charter. And of course, the Freedom Charter opens with the famous word, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And of course, that phrase has been entrenched in the Constitution. Now, this phrase has become a key phrase of contention. Just last month, I felt compelled to write to a rejoinder in one of the Sunday newspapers against a article, not against, but in response to an article by Professor Musibudi Mangena. Now, Professor Mangena, in his article, and the title of the article was the following: declaring South Africa belongs to all who live in it is stupid and counterproductive, end of quote. I won't bore you with the details of what Professor Mangena said and my rejoinder, but I want to say that in various essays, chapters, and indeed in his latest book, Professor Pillay historicizes and shows the discursive shifts in this notion of belonging. Of course, from apartheid's use of history narrative, anthropology, not apartheid, colonial, the colonial use of history, anthropology. You will remember the empty land thesis, to apartheid, institutionalizing that discourse, but also interpreting Black people no longer as a native, as Bantu, and therefore confined to homelands and therefore foreign to South Africa. So, and of course, lately, Deputy President Thabo Mbeki idea of I'm an African in 1996. So this phrase, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, has become, as I said, a touchstone in political debates. Professor Pillay, your scholarship has been long been a compass for many of us navigating the complexities of post-apartheid transformation. Tonight, you have reminded us that decolonization is not a destination, but a method, one that requires courage, humility, and indeed intellectual generosity, as you have done by citing your predecessors and your contemporaries. That shows a spirit of generosity. Indeed, in your earlier works, such as Where Do You Belong, as well as the radical imagination of peace, you address this question of belonging and nationhood head on. You take us through the journey of belonging defined by our colonizers who erase the history of the presence of the indigenous people of our land to make a space for themselves in South Africa's story of belonging. That was then adapted and manipulated by Afrikaner nationalist identity and rule during apartheid, as you say, and I quote, settlers had become natives. Natives now belonged, but they belonged elsewhere. They were to become foreigners. This narrative was then transformed into, as I said, Mbeki's notion of African, end of quote. Of course, I take issue with how you characterize the Pan-African Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress idea of African, but this is not a response. We shall take it offline. As part of the continuing journey of decolonization, belongingness, and nationhood, my office this year at the South African Human Rights Commission, and I don't know why you invited a lawyer to this, by the way. My office at the South African Human Rights Commission, we launched a campaign that we called Promoting a Culture of Human Rights through the resolution of the national question, promoting a culture of human rights through the resolution of the national question. It's a 6-year campaign that we will be dealing with. But at the launch, which happened in March this year, a lot of the themes that Professor Pillay has dealt with came out very viscerally in some of the participants in the launch. One of the speakers was the Royal Prince of the Indigenous Kwe people. His name is Prince Xavier Ibib. And he said the following: we pretend everything is normal, but many communities have never truly felt welcome into this nation. We still have no land, we still have no language recognized, end of quote. Another participant that most of you will know, Gareth Prince, Gareth Prince, who spoke on behalf of the Rastafari Nation Council, but also speaking as a descendant of the Khoi, said the following: we were here before apartheid, before the constitution, before the colonial state. Why must we still beg to exist in our land? End of quote. And then finally, echoing Professor Pillay's conclusions in his latest book, one of our keynote speakers, Dr. Mamchilo Mutsei, reminded us that we need to reweave the soul of the notion, noting that democracy alone will not repair the humanity eroded through centuries of oppression. So as we unroll and roll out this campaign, I want to say that Professor Pillay will rely very heavily on your work. I say this very cautiously, noting that we are in a university, but to say that your work transcends the university and indeed is very important to some of us who are certainly not in academia. Last year, I published another article in the Sunday Times where I said the state must stop using racial classification. That was an article in the Sunday Times. The state must stop using racial classification. Now, you can imagine the amount of vitriol, the amount of hate that I got. But indeed, if we are to move forward, as Professor Pillay implores us, we need to transcend the colonial logics inherited from apartheid. And I want to quote from one of his essays, and I quote, "The African continental experience suggests that the political discourse might need both a new concept of justice and a new concept of difference. A concept of justice that is not simply about reversing the logic of colonialism, but refusing the logic of colonialism." And this year, of course, is also the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 1995, started in 1996. Now, of course, today is very fashionable for a lot of us to critique, as I do in my work, the TRC for failing in all its objectives. No truth, no justice, no reconciliation, no nation building, no nation building. But why did the TRC fail? And how do we move forward with this project of resolving the national question, the project of healing, and the project of reconciliation? In an article that came out 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, in 2005, entitled "The Radical Imagination of Peace, Belonging and Violence in South Africa," Professor Pillay reminds us as follows: that violence of dispossession and segregation the violence of dispossession and segregation was rooted in the discourse of race and belonging, and thus, I quote, "Peace required a radical act of imagination to transcend these historical logics." Professor Pillay shows that from the 1960s onwards, the critiques of apartheid increasingly framed injustice as a matter of denial of human rights. Of course, aligning with international norms and UN declaration that branded apartheid against humanity. And this was a mistake, because of course, this universalist framing overshadowed the colonial logic of apartheid and narrowed the critique to individual violations. And that's why Professor Pillay shows that early activism emphasized the vast scale of dispossession and forced removals. Later, the focus was on discrete human rights abuses, detentions, torture, disappearance, and so forth, that therefore shaped TRC methodology. Ultimately, the legal struggle secured the cultural prestige of law rather than dismantling colonial foundations. I'm a product of this legacy. I want to skip because I know we have run out of time. I had entitled this response, or not this response, this vote of thanks as Professor Pillay's predicaments and on the reimagination of political futures. You know, he loves the word predicaments. That's why I titled this Professor Pillay's predicaments. Let me end with a story, an anecdote that surfaces some of these predicaments that Professor Pillay urges us to focus on. 2 weeks ago, the commission, the South African Human Rights Commission, lost a case against Operation Dudula. We lost it on a technicality of agency. The concept is not urgent. You know, the fact that people have been denied the right to go into hospital clinics, it is not urgent. It should come back later. Now, I want to say that what is happening now forces us to reckon with some of these predicaments that Professor Pillay has been talking about. The first predicament is, of course, a predicament of the nation state. Because, of course, Operation Dudula, March on March, and others, their message is predicated on the notion of who belongs and who does not belong. And, of course, Professor Pillay has showed us that the nation state is always violence. Secondly, the predicament of governance. Because of course it is true that our hospitals, our clinics are full, they're not enough, there's not enough staff, and that there's no medication. So the dysfunctionality of the post-colonial state, a very big problem. Here I want to quote one of the very nice quotes from Professor Pillay. And I quote, the insecurity of living under the authoritarian police state of apartheid that was everywhere may have been replaced by the insecurity of the increasingly absent state, the predicament of governance. But largely it surfaces the predicament of human rights. And I say this as a human rights commissioner. Because of course, these groups are mobilizing the language of human rights. You know, they're saying, as the sons and daughters of the soil, we deserve the right to health care. They don't deserve the right to health care. But also, of course, they are de-universalizing human rights. We say human rights only applies to those who are here. So we are in a very bad space in South Africa. Let me end with this quote from Professor Pillay. And I will end with this. I've got many things to say, some of them contentious, but I will end with this. And I quote, freedom as an invention and the making of new discoveries imply breaking with the reactive logic that the last shall be the first and the first shall be the last. We need to break with that. And we need a concept of difference that doesn't use the past to decide if one belongs and has a political future. One that allows an embrace of the multiple historical roots through which people find themselves in a particular settler colonial society, as locals, as descendants of slaves, as indentured laborers, as traders, as exiles, as refugees who came to make a better life. We need a Pan-African concept of difference that remains open to inviting new migrants to becoming citizens as well. The challenge, therefore, is to dare to invent a future with difference, with economic justice, but without racism. End of quote. So thank you, Professor Pillay, for your scholarship, for your humility, for your courage, but most importantly, for your clarity. Thank you so much.
Professor Madlingozi, to living up to your promise. He was very clear that his will be a vote of thanks, not an overlay of one inaugural lecture on another. And you saw how he resisted the temptation for a response. We also note your missing the academy. We are very relieved that you missed the academy, but rest assured, judging by the responses to some of your reflections here, I'm sure you should expect an invitation soon. Thank you, colleagues, students, family members, and guests for joining us this evening. Professor Pillay, acknowledging that you came to UCT an already accomplished academic. Thank you again for agreeing to giving this inaugural lecture. Your lecture captured what it truly means to be a scholar at the University of Cape Town, but beyond as well. It demonstrated how critical inquiry, when grounded in integrity and curiosity, can reveal new perspectives on both our past and our future, calling into question the hubris to name, to classify, and to enslave. Please let's give him one more round of want to thank everyone who contributed to making this evening a success. Our colleagues in the Center for African Studies, the Faculty of Humanities, the Communication and Marketing Department, and the organizing teams. Thank you for your hard work behind the scenes. As we close, let us carry forward the spirit of inquiry and reflection that this lecture has inspired. So I invite you to join us as we converse informally outside with refreshments to accompany. Thank you once again.
Okay, now, let's get out.